This is my final reflection for our 7 weeks together. I'll be commenting on the collaborative project that you turned in and also this week's discussion post. Hopefully most of you have noticed this. Nothing is due for next week. Yep, that's right. After this week, we are all on vacation, at least from this class. So let's take a moment and let's take a look at the collaborative designs. I provided feedback to each one of you, but my purpose in doing this was hopefully to get you to take the content that we had discussed, the topics, the theory that we had talked about in this last 7 weeks, and put together some sort of a presentation that's reflective of what you had learned. And by putting you in these collaborative groups, that you might build on each other and say, oh, remember this or remember that. And you did a really good job with it. I could see that there were pieces of it, especially as you talked about the theoretical framework, as you looked at your evaluation and how you were going to present those topics. And I gave some detailed feedback to each one of the groups. I especially like the fact that you looked at the assumptions, which I have up here about adult learners, and this is a bit paraphrased, but most of you cited page 47 in your text. And you wanted to make sure that you were doing these checks as you went along. Learners' self-concept, their engagement, they resent or have a resistance if you don't allow them to have voice. They have experience that they bring to this. That's different than children. They developmentally have concrete and abstract experiences, and they are able to bring those and connect prior learning to the concepts. Leverage it. Make them part of the learning. 3, readiness to learn. They have a social role as adults, so there's a sense of immediacy. They are ready to learn. That's why they're sometimes they're being required, but oftentimes they're opting in. Even if they're being required, they have probably chosen that career or that job. So they feel a bit, hopefully, of investment in what is happening with them as an adult learner. Problem-centered, there's a sense of immediacy. They need to solve something. They need to figure it out. And that hopefully all triggers some internal motivation. Really, all 1 through 4 is triggering internal motivation, which will sustain their learning, which will help them not just with the content that you have, but get them kind of thinking about how they can continue to learn and some self-directed learning. And of course, some of you talked a little bit about modeling that. Lastly, the need to know. These situations present a challenge to adult educators who have not relied on the learner's internal motivation and need to know to become fully engaged. At the very least, facilitators can make an intellectual case for the value of learning in improving the effectiveness of the learner's performance and quality of their lives. And that was actually something that this is a slide that I took from when we discussed chapter 3. But I also mentioned doing things that use this strategy of simulation, project-based learning, and of course the 5 E's, where you engage the learner and they get to elaborate and explore what is being presented, the topics that are being presented. And many of you talked about this as a strategy, and we'll dive into that next when we're looking at some of the discussion comments this week. Overall, I was pretty impressed with what you put together, and I hope that you found this kind of an interesting way to do a program and to really bring other people's thoughts into it, hopefully be inclusive of everybody, and then have some negotiation and some compromise by hopefully not violating the assumptions of adult learners. All right, let's move on then to week 7's discussion. And I mentioned it here, I'll say it again. There is a lot of material here. The chapter was one of the more healthy chapters in terms of length, but the content was dense and it required real focus on your part. I asked for your voice because I really wanted to hear your thoughts, and I knew that there would be a lot more words than you'd probably want to type. I wanted to hear your tone and the way you presented your words. And I was really looking at, in some cases, your body language, your expressions on this topic, because of the types of things that were being discussed. Critical thinking sometimes makes us uncomfortable. A few of you commented on being uncomfortable is part of the place we need to get learners to, so that they feel safe in being uncomfortable, but still presenting their views. So I really appreciated the thoughtful posts, in some cases very insightful posts that were inside of week 7. So those were the question really then was, do you think creating a critical classroom is necessary in secondary and post-secondary settings, non-formal and formal? Why? Would all concepts discussed in the course require critical thinking? Please provide some examples from your own experience. For the most part, and there was a couple of people waffling, you all felt like that critical thinking has a place in instruction. Critical thinking has a place inside of your teaching or your classroom, whether it be formal or non-formal. And many of you discuss situations where you don't think it was, not that it wasn't appropriate, but it just isn't required. And that was coming from a lot of you who are in current technical education where you are teaching very specific skills. So I want to address that a little bit because the chapter talked about critical thinking not being quite like problem solving. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Just a side note, hearing your voice again made it so there wasn't a bunch of scrolling, but yet we still could really take away your message. Let me skip over here. Kari had this post. She was posting back to Amy Norman. While I love this chapter, I've struggled with how to incorporate critical thinking in all of our construction and manufacturing courses. So she's talking specifically about skill-based courses, which many of you did in other discussions. So I just grabbed hers, but I think this happened in every single discussion group. For example, welding or diesel mechanics. Some of you offered up woodworking. Some of you offered up medical kinds of practices, those things. These are jobs that are learned and demonstrated individually in a lab-type environment, hopefully in authentic ways that they can do them out in the real world. There is no lecture or collaboration between students. These might be situations where critical thinking is not relevant. Well, honestly, sometimes a student is going to need to perform something on their own. And there may not be so much involved in a collaborative type of thing where you're coming together until you get to the part about problem solving. And let's take a look then at what the chapter actually says about that. Pull it up right here. Critical thinking does not require a college education or advanced understanding of philosophy, nor it is problem solving or creativity. Nor is it problem solving or creativity. And we'll come back to the definition in just a minute. It does not mean you criticize persons or things. There's a difference between being a critical thinker and being a cynic. That means that rather than presenting positive parts of something else that could, on a particular topic for perhaps doing some type of problem solving or at least offering some different insight to an issue so you can go a different direction, that those kinds of things are really, when it just always is negative, that's really the definition of a cynic, not of a critically thinking person. Nor is it associated with age or IQ. Being critical in adult education has at least 3 aspects, and most of you talked about these first 2, mostly the second one. But the first is critical theory. It's a philosophy of understanding critical perspectives and approaches. Okay, theory, philosophy of understanding critical perspectives. And that was what the next section of the text talked about. The second was critical thinking is in a reflective process of assessing what we believe or do. So that's a little different. We are reflecting on the process of assessing what we believe and do. So it is not just like putting it out there and saying and thinking critically about a scenario that we are presented with, but rather we are also reflecting on what our thought process is. And I think that second step was sort of like glossed over in most of the discussion. The third one was critical action, and really only I think 2 or 3 of you talked about this, and that's the ability to make timely and mindful interventions once you have critically assessed your thoughts, behaviors, and options. It means taking action based on the thought process that's been presented and then move in that direction. This framework was outlined on table 11.1 and discussed in the following section. So we'll skip down here in just a second. There's table 11.1 and the different types of thought processes. In fact, here's the theory, critiquing social conditions. Again, maybe there's some factual things that wouldn't fit in here. Challenging truth, meaning that a certain group believes that it's a certain way and that's their truth. But in a different context, it might not be their truth. Seeking emancipation and elimination from oppression in society. All of those are kind of a theoretical way to look at critical theory. And then critical thinking, reflecting on the assumptions and beliefs we have, maybe changing them up, critiquing self-thought and action, hunting assumptions, checking assumptions, seeing things from different points of views, and connecting the individual experience to a broader social condition. These are things where we really start to reflect on our own thought processes. Am I in the zone? Am I really checking my assumptions? Am I questioning my assumptions? Could they be a field from what I know, being presented with some different types of evidence or thoughts or beliefs. And then this final one down here is taking action, monitoring self and group processes, clarifying and changing thought, altering behavior, making timely interventions, and then justifying our actions. They also had a table in here. I'll try not to make you seasick. So I highlighted this, or shall we say screen sick. Critical thinking, the ability to assess your assumptions. Okay, so this is the definition then. Critical, and many of you highlighted this in your post, probably in at least 2 or maybe 3 or 4 of the discussion groups. But critical thinking, the ability to assess your assumptions, beliefs, and actions is imperative to survival. Many of you highlighted that. Failure to engage in it makes you a target for those who may wish to harm or manipulate you. Intellectually engaged, skillful, and responsible thinking that facilitates good judgment. Critical thinking requires the application of assumptions, and that's why we examine them. Knowledge, competence, and the ability to challenge one's own thinking. Critical thinking skills require self-correction, monitoring to judge the reasonableness of thinking, and reflexivity. If you are not able to think critically, you will not be able to defend yourself and ultimately get the outcomes you desire. Effective critical thinking is important to make good decisions throughout life, such as relationship choices, friends, dating, career selection, political orientation, dietary options and financial strategies, living situation, and child rearing. And all of those topics they're pretty close to problem solving. I mean, in reality, we go through some of the same mental steps with a couple of exceptions. We're not usually challenging our assumptions. We're not really thinking critically about another person's point of view to make that decision in that problem solving. Therein lies the difference. There's this piece of front end before the problem solving actually begins in the back end. And that's something I wanted to bring out to those of you who talked about how can I relate career and technical education types of objectives to critical thinking when we just think we're presented with the facts. I'd say probably there's some instances where that doesn't really happen. And I agree with all of you on that comment. See, in that text, let me bring that back up for just one second. I was thinking there was another chart here that I highlighted, but maybe not. I think a few of you, here it is. You referenced, forgot to highlight it, activities for creating a critical classroom and some strategies. I'm going to come back to that. I just wanted to make sure it was there and up. So Lacey posed this question, and I need to, true disclosure here. I created this little cut and paste page with all of the word postings of some of the comments, and I had to really triage this because so many really interesting comments were made in the group, and I had to delete about 7 of them, or this video might have been more than an hour, thereby delaying your summer vacation. But I did pull out a few and I think got at the main point. So Lacey had this: I'm currently taking a history and philosophy and policy development and career and technical education course here on campus, and we're repeatedly having conversations about different perceptions and ideologies of vocational training, vocational education, and career technology education. These are all skill-based kinds of areas. As we have all experienced opposition from general education, she's talking about the academic subjects, mainstreams, perhaps looking down upon career and technical education, I was prompted to use this chapter to identify strategies to create a conversation using critical thinking with our classrooms, to walk our students through the discovery of these different ideologies. My hope is to expand student awareness of CTE, especially within secondary education institutions, prompting them to identify the value of CTE as well as the scholarship associated with the various career paths. Can anyone think of a brief way to assist secondary education students or undergraduates with activities or conversations to prompt their critical thinking regarding what CTE is? Well, I would simply get you to ask questions like this. Where do you use your math concepts? In what careers? How would that be applied in XYZ careers? You see, they provide some skills, but the skills are played out in the workplace. So it comes back to the ability to question and ask the right questions, and not answer them as kind of yes or no, but very open-ended. And you may already have your opinion. You may say to them, what do you think about this? And not use body language or disclose what your thoughts are, because that might bias you and they may challenge your assumption and maybe make you critically think about your position so that you can come back and really refine that. So I think that's a really good question. And since that was a conversation in so many groups about career and technical education as having these skills-based areas where it's, you either do this or you don't, medical field, not every piece of content is going to lend itself to that. Well, and I'll digress one more time. There was in the area of medical, doing procedures, you definitely want them to be able to perform an appendectomy if you have an appendicitis. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a discussion about surgery practices related to healthcare. And we all know the different positions on that. But a person may have to be pretty well informed about that surgical process, what it takes, how much it costs, that kind of thing. They've performed it, they have that skill, but now they enter a dialogue about policy. And so I think that having that as foundational knowledge is crucial. That will lead them to be able to have a critical thinking type of conversation. My question is, do you see critical thinking as part of the hidden curriculum? This was from Kari, I don't know, but we have a Kari and a Kari in the class. Do you see critical thinking as part of the hidden curriculum, or is it an actual assignment? Is it an actual assignment? How do you grade it? Simply by participation, or are there elements that can be assessed? Well, she's got a lot of moving parts in this, actually. There's 2 or 3 things, but Christine attempted. I think it's a great question. It could be both. My first thought is for implementing critical thinking into my classroom, where to take time to ask more questions and foster critical thinking process with my students, which means she's asking very open-ended types of questions. Ill-structured, meaning multiple pathways. I have thought recently that I can put more control onto my students for their learning, or responsibility. I expect too many specific things that might not be conducive in some types of learners. For an assessment, I think I would assess the process more than the outcome. I think that's really good, especially if you're trying to get them to be critical thinkers. And I would set up a rubric. Bingo, that answered the second part of Kari's question, that outlined the process I wanted them to go through, and then the students would somehow show me that they went through that thinking process. I think these are very good tips. So having this list of questions that have students to explain different aspects of their thinking, or having the process outlined and the students show me in some way how they went through the steps on their own, either in a video or a journal or assignment format, this would also be very helpful to recognize the reflection part, hopefully getting back at their assumptions, and how their thoughts, learning, and research come together to complete an idea. What are your thoughts about implementation? David also added this. Good question, Kari. I think, Christine, about fitting into both. I think, like Christine, I'm fitting them into both, but I personally think the best way to do this is hidden within the curriculum, so your students can show evidence of critical thinking without being told to do so, in a great way to gauge your thinking. I think you can do both. I think you can be overt about it so that you can model it. Keep in mind that throughout their formal education, most of what they have learned has been spoon-fed. You do this, you read this, this is the answer, as some of you noted, and you take a test and you get it right or wrong. And oftentimes, I think it was Jacob Christensen said, I just wanted to get it right. I didn't want to think critically about it. There was a grade at the end of the day. And that's why sometimes I have issues with grading. I provide rubrics, but I really hope you'll get to my expectation, because I don't want to use the lower part of the rubric. I really think that if you facilitate learning, you can truly get your students there. So modeling is crucial. They've been spoon-fed this their whole time. So I think being overt and getting them through the process, and then being covert and letting them know later maybe that they went through the process is also good. That's the hidden curriculum. Shayna. Hi, Kimberly. You mentioned that it is up to the presenter or teacher to know. Did I skip through this one? No, I got it. You mentioned that it is up to the presenter or teacher to know those they are presenting to or educating to determine if creating critical thinking experience is right for those they are presenting to. How would you go about assessing this? If you were teaching this one class with participants that you hadn't met before, would you avoid setting up a critical thinking activity? With adults, the answer is no. I would assume they're adults. I would put those 6 assumptions back into play. They have experiences. Might they hijack the conversation and take it a different direction? Yes. As the facilitator of their learning, it's your job to bring it back to the question or the issue that's actually being discussed. So I wouldn't worry about that. You do have to be concerned about time, and that's a constraint that you might have. But I wouldn't worry about if there's a way to bring critical thinking into a particular concept to get their own opinions on that. I think that that is a very useful tool. I'll give you one more example. Week before last, I was at the College and Career Awareness Conference, and I did a presentation on project-based learning. I had 75 people in that session, a classroom with seats for 45, so they were everywhere in the room. But I really decided to change up how I was going to present project-based learning. And these teachers had actually already been through, some of them, actually all of them, well, most of them, through 2 years of doing project-based learning with their students, meaning they had a lot of experience, meaning I could leverage their experiences into a teaching opportunity. And that was my goal. That's what I did. And I really hoped that I had hit the goal. And I knew I did because at the end of the session, one of the teachers said to me, "Thank you for listening to our perspective. You know, administrators and other folks forget that we're creative people. We know how to do these things. I really appreciated that you allowed us to share and comment on what each other were doing and then offer your guidance and allowed others to answer the questions." It was reflective process. It was empowering those teachers to learn. So it works, and I wouldn't be frightened of it, except for make sure you're within constraints and things don't get out in the weeds. It's okay to go in different directions, just that you want to stay on the green. You don't want to be too far out in the weeds. And that's your job, to facilitate that learning. But there are topics. Many of you mentioned that you talked about the memorization and the recall of facts, and I already mentioned what Jacob Christensen said about, he was just trying to get through and answer the test. And it took him a while as an undergraduate to get to the point of, professors sometimes want me to think critically. Now, in some classes, we just got to have the facts. We just need to know parts of the periodic table. Actually, there's got to be some why in there. And if you're bothered by the question why, you probably shouldn't be a teacher. The question why is a good question. Sometimes they need to hold the why, but the question why should be welcomed. It should, when students say, "Why are we learning this?" you should have an automatic answer. You should be completely ready for that. I'm not sure your counterparts in maybe the math or even English or even the science classroom are totally ready for that question. But I think those of you going through a master's program, and especially those of you in career technical education, should be totally ready for that question. Shana, I agree with what you said. This is Jacob replying to Shana. Shana, I agree with what you said. Something you said gave me a thought. You said that not every topic needs critical approach, i.e. memorizing countries. You also said that it's different when student starts to learn about each of the countries he or she has to memorize, because at that point you start to use a critical approach. Do you think it's fair to say that critical thinking can be applied to any topic, but only once it becomes a deeper learning? In other words, there's some other type of question beyond the recall. Remember Bloom's taxonomy? He says right here, like found on Bloom's taxonomy. It's beyond that recall, that knowledge. We're now getting to those things where we're starting to evaluate and to synthesize what it is and to create something out of the knowledge that we have. So yeah, sometimes there's going to need to be a foundation. Oftentimes, you can start in the middle of the triangle of Bloom's taxonomy, and by trying to get to analyze something or compare and contrast something, you actually have to learn the facts or the foundational understanding. And that's a constructivist approach. Starting near the top of that pyramid, those types of more complex things, synthesis and analysis and creating, that requires us to backtrack to what would be considered the foundational or knowledge-based types of facts. So file that away as a visualization. Also, it was Corey that wanted to add in on Shana's conversation or post. I understand where you're coming from, but to have a question about why you would not want to teach geography or country locations critically. Sure, we can teach about memorization, but I feel like geography can only be understood through critical lens when we start thinking and reflecting about why and how geography plays into global relations. If we're teaching to the level of Bloom taxonomy that we all strive for, we would likely not focus just on memorization. Well, quite honestly, you probably need to know sometimes some facts about how many countries are in Africa or closer to home. I actually had this, was taken to task on this topic just last week by a Canadian. How many provinces are there? Or more importantly, where are those provinces? Sometimes we've become so American-centric that we know the 50 states, we know where they are, but there's a more global piece. So you might actually have some fact-based things. But then the next question comes to, why do these lines exist between the states? Why do these lines exist between the countries? Now we have a conversation about resources. And military tactics, and all those other things that can get us into more of a critical thought. So again, I think thinking about Bloom's, thinking about a constructivist learning approach to these topics really supports critical thinking. Final comment. Thanks for doing your best on these and being thoughtful on your comments and questions. I have a rubric for shallow posts, and some weeks I know that some of you are stressed and maybe didn't do as deeper reading, and I might have commented back on that. But for the most part, I really appreciated your posts. I have this rubric, but I prefer not to use it. I really want to just see all of you reflect on the content. That reflective practice is what's really going to result in that internal understanding of the concept. So I really appreciated that you made, for the most part, very thoughtful posts this entire semester. It makes it a lot easier for me to review and a lot easier to score when posts are reflective and the concepts are thoughtful. And my last comment is, if you haven't done the evaluation for this course, please do so. I think when I checked the other day, there was about half, and I need the other half because there's 31 of you in here, and I want to hear all voices so that I have a true picture of how I can improve this course and what you thought of the content and how it related to your expectations and so forth. Anyway, thanks for a great last 7 weeks. Thanks for being timely and being able to communicate. I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that my assignments were practical. I know the online learning stretched some people, but it's the 21st century. I think you'll probably have to use that skill. You're going to need to collaborate and to build projects. And you're also going to need to think critically, which I think is a great way to end this course. Look forward to having some of you in future courses. And if I don't, hopefully I wish you all great success in completing your degree.